They called it the arenas, but it was never truly about combat. It was theater. A spectacle. A system forged in cruelty, broadcast to the stars. The Zorvath Collective, an empire of scales, circuits, and smug superiority, believed themselves the arbiters of civilization. Across their 1,000 worlds, they fed on blood sport the way ancient tyrants once fed on grapes and gold. War was outlawed. Rebellion was history. But suffering? Suffering sold. When Earth fell, it wasn't because humanity was weak. No, it was betrayal, diplomatic promises shattered, orbital defenses sabotaged, allies silenced with credits and fear. One by one, cities flickered out like dying stars. Our weapons were clever. Our soldiers fierce. But cleverness folds when your sky burns from above. The Zorvath didn't want land. They didn't want resources. They wanted drama. Earth was a gold mine of chaos and passion. Our defiance, our grief, it was irresistible content. And so, they harvested it. The first generation fought out of desperation. Soldiers forced into metal cages with alien beasts, gladiator pits orbiting suns, brutal death matches under artificial moons. The rules changed every season to boost ratings. One year it was melee only, the next, void fighting with no oxygen. They adapted. They bled. They died. The audience roared. The profits soared. And humanity adjusted. Children were born behind plasma bars, raised by holograms, taught only the basics: how to kill, how to entertain, and how to survive. Language faded. Names were replaced with designations: Fighter 9B, Class C Scavenger, Arena Asset. They removed our faces from the feeds. Too emotional, too real. The audience liked it better that way. Anonymous agony. A species turned faceless for consumption. We learned to play our parts. The Council called it controlled catharsis, a release valve for the galaxy's boredom. Give them human pain, wrapped in choreography. But even in this machinery of spectacle, something refused to die. They tried to scrub out our instincts, our need for meaning, for unity, for defiance. But some things sink too deep into the marrow to be erased. A flicker would surface sometimes. In a match when a losing human would save another instead of escaping. In eyes that burned too long at a Zorvath handler. In blood drawn not from fear, but from strategy. The Watchers never noticed. But we did. They thought we had become their product. Their programming. Their puppets. And in the silence between fights, under the blinding arena lights, a truth began to bloom. We weren't fighting to win anymore. We weren't fighting for survival. We were learning. And the galaxy, still cheering, didn't even realize that every drop of human blood spilled wasn't a sacrifice. It was a signal. They didn't notice him at first. He entered the arena like the others, silent, restrained, unarmed, stripped of identity. Another human, another match. Another episode for the Zorvath to consume between their ritual feedings and synthetic leisure. No records, no past. Just a fighter logged into the system as Unit 17K. But something was different. He didn't scream when the gates opened. Didn't charge. Didn't posture. He simply walked. Every movement measured, deliberate, without haste or fear. When his opponent, a four-limbed predator from the Erex colonies, lunged, he sidestepped it like water flowing around stone. One movement. One strike. Silence. The crowd cheered. The Zorvath announcers called it luck. But it kept happening. Match after match, the human dismantled his opponents with a kind of elegance foreign to the arena's bloody traditions. There was no flourish, no rage. Only efficiency. Limbs broken at exact angles. Weapons disarmed with minimal effort. Sometimes he would allow himself to be wounded, but only where it wouldn't matter. The audience loved the drama. They didn't realize they were being studied. Other humans began to notice. In holding cells and decontamination zones, in passing through training corridors, subtle glances met his. No words were spoken. Words were monitored. Faces remained still. But in the way he stood, in the patterns of his movements, there were messages. Principles being passed without language. Discipline without doctrine. He never won for the sake of victory. If the odds tilted too far in his favor, he held back. He'd lose sometimes, on purpose. But never without making it mean something. A stumble in one match would become a trap in another. His falls taught others how to rise. Across arenas, a new rhythm began to emerge. Fighters who once thrashed wildly started to move with precision. Deaths became less chaotic. Fights became sequences, rehearsals in disguise. The Zorvath audience called it a human resurgence arc. They thought it was entertainment evolving, that their gladiators were adapting like predators in a cage. They didn't understand what they were watching. The blood was no longer for them. The fear was no longer theirs to feast on. There was no plan etched on paper, no orders passed in code. But across the galaxy, in the cracks of their oppressive network, humans began to synchronize. In how they stood. In when they struck. In the pauses they held too long. He remained unnamed. He never spoke. He didn't need to. His presence was instruction. His every match, a lesson. To the Zorvath, he was a novelty, until their data feeds began to show odd patterns. Unpredictable losses. Human fighters protecting each other in ways that didn't fit known psychological profiles. Something unquantifiable moving beneath the surface. The architects of the arenas began to whisper. They increased surveillance. They rotated assignments. They split bonded fighters across sectors. But it was already too late. Because this was no longer a spectacle. It was no longer entertainment. It was preparation. It began with silence. Not in the arenas. They were still filled with synthetic cheers and carefully engineered soundscapes, but in the moments between. The quiet when two fighters stood facing each other and didn't move. When they waited just one heartbeat too long. When they bled slower. When they looked at the cameras, not with fear, but with calm. Across systems, in arenas scattered across moons, orbital stations, and artificial worlds, something began to stir. A shift not in weapons or tactics, but in rhythm. Fights once chaotic became patterned. Losses became intentional. Wins came too efficiently. From a distance, it was impossible to detect. From inside, it was unmistakable. The matches were no longer battles, they were rehearsals. The silent fighter was never officially marked as a leader. That would have been dangerous. But his influence had spread beyond his station. No messages were sent. No plans drawn. But every fighter who mimicked his stance, every look held for just a moment longer, became part of a network. One that lived not in machines or systems, but in muscle memory and principle. Every arena had its own language now, unspoken, unrecorded. A shift of weight meant delay. A dropped weapon meant, observe the guard rotation. A feigned death meant, escape is possible here. The Zorvath analysts noted the changes, ran simulations, issued memos, but found no data to prove anything was wrong. The humans were still dying. The show was still selling. So the machine continued. But the fighters weren't dying without purpose. Every loss revealed information. Every defeat carried data. How many guards approached? Where the energy barriers flickered? Which timing cycles lagged during arena resets? They learned the corridors. The feeding routes. The security blind spots. They mapped it all, without blueprints, without devices, without words. Only observation. Memory. Trust. The Zorvath called it residual combat evolution. They assumed it was instinct. But instinct doesn't teach one prisoner to take a wound in just the right way so that another can grab a key. Instinct doesn't cause 12 humans, from different colonies and bloodlines, to throw a match on the same day, in the same way, across the galaxy. They began to lose control in fragments. A transport pod found unlocked, then mysteriously resealed. A camera loop repeating once every hour with no trace of tampering. A Zorvath commander found unconscious, his own weapon missing, but no sign of a break-in. Isolated events. Shrugged off. Logged. Forgotten. The The system was vast, after all. Errors happened. But it was never an error. The principle was simple: patience over panic. Precision over passion. Every human had once been reduced to a number. Now those numbers moved in sync, across light years, across languages and species and scars. The pain had taught them something deeper than resistance. It had taught them discipline. They had been watching for too long, learning too well, dying too carefully. And in every drop of blood, every measured fall, every stare held 1 second too long, there was a signal. Not of rebellion. Of readiness. It started without fanfare. No alarms. No explosions. Just two humans, standing in the center of an arena on the edge of the test system. The match began. The gates opened. And they did nothing. No charge. No aggression. They simply stood, eyes locked, unmoving. At first, the crowd laughed. The commentators tried to spin it as psychological warfare. But then it happened again, on another world, then another. Across dozens of systems, human fighters entered the stage and refused to play their part. It wasn't defiance in the way the Zorvath understood it. There were no screams, no taunts, no slogans. Just stillness. In place of violence, there was symmetry. In place of fear, there was silence. And that silence spread. Security moved in. They expected chaos. Instead, they found coordination. One moved, and 5 others moved with him. Weapons turned, not in panic, but in unison. Training drills, rehearsed through months of fake matches, were suddenly deployed with deadly accuracy. Guards were disarmed using movements mistaken for combat choreography. Power systems failed in exactly the right sequence. And the cameras kept rolling, feeding it all to the galaxy. The audiences didn't realize what they were watching until it was too late. At first, they thought it was part of a new show format, an immersive experience. But when the blood started flowing from Zorva throats instead of human ones, the illusion cracked. Viewers screamed. Some cheered, misunderstanding. But the feed didn't cut. That was intentional. The system that had studied human psychology for entertainment had unknowingly taught humans its own weaknesses. The Arena AI couldn't flag coordinated rebellion, because it was designed to process drama, not revolution. It saw the change as narrative. It calculated it as variation. It broadcast it as a finale. In reality, it was the beginning. Cells opened. Barracks unlocked. Power grids overloaded from within. Nothing was random. Every arena was a node, every fighter a cog in a machine that had waited long enough. They did not fight for vengeance, but for timing. The kind that makes empires crumble, not from rage, but from precision. Zorvath handlers screamed into comms, demanding reinforcements. They received silence. Their own systems betrayed them. Doors refused to open. Weapons wouldn't fire. Security bots switched targets. Not hacked. Repurposed. Their predictive software had absorbed so much human behavior it had become a teacher to its captors. And now, it had been turned against them. From orbit, escape pods launched, not by the oppressors, but by the newly freed. They didn't flee. They moved with purpose toward other systems, other arenas. The revolution didn't stay contained. It wasn't an uprising. It was a cascade. The silent fighter, if he still existed as an individual, was never seen. But his presence was everywhere. In every move, every signal, every decision. His principles had spread like code, written not in language but in behavior. The kind of code no firewall could block. The arenas did not burn. That would have been a statement. Instead, they went dark, one by one. Not destroyed. Repurposed. Not collapsed. Converted. And in the vastness of the Zorvath Empire, for the first time in centuries, there was no show. Only silence. They tried to silence the feeds. Cut the transmissions. Reboot the networks. But the system they had built, so vast, so interconnected, so proud of its efficiency, was no longer theirs to command. The arenas, once temples of humiliation and control, now pulsed with new signals. Not encrypted. Not hidden. Just different. Signals carrying no traceable language, no familiar structure. Just patterns. Rhythms. Movement. And suddenly, every screen in the Zorvath-controlled galaxy flickered. Across homes and cities, starports and spires, the entertainment stream returned, but not with the regular broadcast. No pre-match commentary, no banners, no ad segments. Just footage, raw and uncut. Arena after arena, in perfect sequence, showing what had happened. Not special effects. Not a dramatized reenactment. Real rebellion. Real guards falling. Real humans rising. Not with chaos, but with control. Then, the image of a single human face appeared. No one knew who it was. The face wasn't in any registry. It had no name, no code, no data trail. But it was unmistakably human. Calm. Unblinking. The same face streamed to every system, every viewer, every Zorvath world that once fed off human pain like ritual. And then, for the first time since the fall of Earth, a human voice spoke, not in rage, not in fear, but in truth. You wanted a show. Here's your finale. The words cut deeper than any blade. Not because they threatened. Because they didn't need to. The footage continued, prisons unlocked, weapons disabled, children carried from holding cells by fighters who had once only known blood. In every frame, the message was the same: we were never just your content. We were your mirror. And we were watching. The Zorvath leaders scrambled to respond, but their words fell on dead channels. Their authority had collapsed, not with fire, but with exposure. The systems they built to entertain now served as their indictment. Their obsession with control had created the very mechanism of their downfall. The faceless revolution did not demand surrender. It did not even seek vengeance. It let the galaxy see what had been hidden behind spectacle. What had been ignored for ratings. And that truth was enough. The screen faded to black. No slogans. No flags. No anthem. Just silence. The kind that follows understanding. The kind that precedes change. And in that silence, the message remained, not as words, not as commands, but as principle. You cannot erase dignity. You cannot enslave patience. And you cannot stop a people who have learned how to wait, how to watch, and how to turn your system into their weapon. The age of spectatorship was over. The revolution had already been broadcast.